Say thank you to everyone for joining us. This is the fourth in a series of online seminars from the Competitive Enterprise Institute, Repeal for Resilience. In the past few weeks, we've focused a lot of energy toward a never-needed issue campaign. Rules that impede response to the pandemic, and rules that stand in the way of recovery. Last week, the President signed an executive order directing his administration to use its authority, including emergency powers, to focus on rules that were never needed in the first place. It's not too much of a stretch to say that the executive order came right out of the CEI playbook. Specifically, the President directed attention toward repeal of regulations that stand in the way of economic recovery. So how many rules and regulations clutter the federal code and make it more difficult to hire someone? That may be an unanswerable question. But today we will have a conversation about employment and labor law. It's an area of vital concern for the economy and perhaps never under the spotlight as it is now, with 37 million Americans recently unemployed. To kick off, we'll first hear from U.S. Secretary of Labor Eugene Scalia, and we'll follow that with a conversation featuring CEI Research Fellow Sean Higgins. Secretary Scalia, I want to say welcome to the Competitive Enterprise Institute, at least a welcome virtually. Thank you for joining us this afternoon and for the work that you're doing. We'd love to hear your views on the intersection of regulation and the workplace.
Ken, thank you. Thanks for having me here. And thanks for all the work that you and CEI do for the development of public policy. We in government benefit enormously from the research, the analysis, and the perspective that's brought by those who are outside government. That was President Trump's blue-collar boom. And our goal now as we reopen our businesses and our economy is to get back to that blue-collar boom that we were experiencing just 8 weeks ago. We know we will not get there through government mandates. To return Americans to good-paying jobs, we will rely, as we have throughout our history, on free markets and free people to create economic conditions that benefit all Americans. And I said, let's take a look at our enforcement programs and make sure we're using our resources in the right way. I do think there are times when our enforcement energies are not well directed, that we don't go to the right workplaces. We go to workplaces that actually we don't have much reason to believe are in violation of law. We don't do a good enough job homing in on the places where there may well be violations. So that's something else we're looking at too. But let me give you some concrete things that have been done to address the current economy. One was in the CARES Act. And, you don't like to boast about your unemployment programs. You'd rather be boasting about job creation. But when you're putting, 38 million people onto the unemployment rolls, it is important to capture as many workers who've been adversely affected as you can. And for the first time in the CARES Act, we did pick up the self-employed independent contractors, gig workers. They are eligible for that unemployment benefit too, which I think was an important recognition of the new economy we're in. Another rule that was adopted about 1.5 years ago, and we're now defending in court, has to do with what we call association health plans. And what that rule said was, let's make it easier for small businesses, and in fact for the self-employed, to band together and buy health insurance together, enjoying the same economies of scale and the same negotiation leverage that a large company has, and getting benefits at a reduced cost tailored to their workforce. We got that program into effect, and it was delivering some really extraordinary results, cutting some healthcare costs by about 30%. But some state attorneys general sued. We had a district court stay it. We're now defending it in the DC Circuit. But I thought that was a very good rule for adapting old programs to a new economy. And I'm hopeful for a good outcome in the Court of Appeals. And then just last, we certainly are looking at the way the employment relationship is changing and making sure that we don't allow today's economy to be shackled to old conceptions of that relationship. We have been supportive of genuine independent contractor relationships where they exist, put out an opinion letter on that last year, and we put out a really major deregulatory rule on joint employers. That's when potentially two companies are both employers. That's a rule that we think, again, also relieved billions of dollars of regulatory burdens that had been imposed under the last administration. That's a rule for joint employers that we put out at the beginning of this year. So Kent, the work continues, but those are some of the things that we're working on and that we're continuing to examine as we look at ways to help reopen this economy, which was so vibrant just weeks ago.
If we have time for just one more question,
sure,
Mr. Secretary. I'm picking up a trend, a through line through much of your discussion, and I want to ask you to elaborate for just a moment on the role that states will have. As you talk about the joint employer rule, as you talk about the ability, the discretion that you were able to exercise to pick up in that CARES Act program, independent contractors, gig economy workers, the through line seems to me that the agenda, the focus of the administration is moving rights into the hands of individuals and not into groups necessarily, whether they be unions or other employer groups. What is it that you need as a partner from state policymakers, from state leaders, to help continue push that through line into the way we address employment law in America?
Well, I think the single most important thing, Ken, will just be a shared understanding on the parts of states of the great benefits to workers and, of course, to employers that come from periodically reassessing and reducing the regulatory burdens imposed. At the end of last year, the vice president convened a deregulatory group focused on the states, and he and the president brought together governors to talk about what we're doing and similar things that they can do. And right now, dealing with the pandemic, we're getting a lesson in federalism, and we're seeing how different governors respond in different ways. And we've certainly seen that with deregulatory efforts too. The single best example, which I'm sure you're familiar with, is occupational licensing. There has been probably a tripling in the occupations that require licenses over the last 30 years or so.
And just tease out a little bit this idea that the way the law is structured today, and subsequently all of the enforcement of the law, is really biased toward group or collective as opposed to individual rights and protections that attach to a worker, a employee, an individual, as opposed to groups of people.
Take, for example, the situation we have in California right now with their law AB 5, which was intended to punish gig economy companies, rideshare companies like Lyft and Uber, because their business model is premised on the workers being independent contractors and not employees. And the criticism that the companies faced was that, well, they're just doing this to circumvent the law, to not have to pay overtime, unemployment, address health insurance and that type of stuff, because a contractor that's not an issue with the contractor, that's only an issue with an employee. However, since the virus has happened, we've seen a major problem with that, which is that in order to affect this requirement on employers, the state put very strict limits and regulations on what type of contract work can be done. And in an effort to sort of prevent businesses from being able to do that, but it also meant that a huge number of legitimate freelancers, people who want to work from one gig to another, are suddenly prevented from being able to do that because of this law. I mean, if you're a writer, you can only write so many articles per year for one particular publication. Musicians suddenly found themselves strictly limited in terms of what they can do, and this is where the term gig comes from. I mean, translators. California is a state with a very multicultural state, obviously. And there's a lot of work for translators there, and a lot of that's done sort of on a gig contract basis, and now they can't work. And and a lot of these are things that people can do from their home during the current crisis, that they're literally not being allowed to do because of this law. And the state has, Governor Newsom has resisted rolling it back or making changes to it on the argument that the worker misclassification issue was intended to address is far more important than the concerns of these individual workers. If you look at social media, and I've seen a lot of people, and not necessarily even people who are particularly conservative or right-leaning or would otherwise be considered free marketers or something like that,